lot of businesses that might have been selling products into Russia. The broad strategy of the Biden administration in Europe now, and also Japan and Australia, Canada, the West, they are going to try to starve out the Russian military and economic capability over time by denying them components, technologies, goods that are useful for military purposes. And now will have to start thinking much more about who are our end use customers going to be, goods that are dual use, where you might be able to sell something purpose for military technology. A good example of this would be smartphones or tablets that, as of right now, if you can demonstrate that you only sell to Russian private individuals or Russian private companies, you could still sell into the Russian market, something like a smartphone or a laptop. But how are you going to do that? That's going to be the question I think companies will have to think through a lot more. People who've been exposed to export control issues before, this is not going to be a new experience, but I think a lot of companies, it will be new for them. And there are political and enforcement issues to think about, that even if you have been exposed to export control before, you're really going to have to get it right now, because the reputational and enforcement risk of being a company caught selling advanced technology to Russian military, that's going to be a nightmare for your business and your board. They're going to be asking, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So you're going to need to think much more about, how do we develop these capabilities? Who are our end use customers? What if you are using distributors who maybe it's perfectly fine to sell to them, but how are you going to ensure that they're not selling into Russia? How are you going to do all this when Russia doesn't use the Roman alphabet like English does? And you're going to need to think through language barriers. How are you going to read documents? How are you going to govern your distributors? One thing that struck me was, I read about the troubles, and I know FCPA compliance people are going to be instinctively thinking, distributors, they're the worst. They're always the source of trouble. That's true. But if you had not been selling to government agencies in Russia, you might have had a terribly high corruption risk in Russia in relative terms. Now you are going to have a much higher export control concern. So that's what you're going to have to grapple with and build that capability over the next several months. And it's intriguing. A lot of companies that are at the moment cutting off all business with Russia, they're pretty much admitting this is not going to be worth it. The juice is not worth the squeeze here. We have no idea how we're going to be able to implement this in the immediate term. Let's just not sell to Russia at all. It's good on the PR front. It's going to be good on the regulatory enforcement. And it's going to be the simplest way to obey export compliance, is you just don't sell to Russia, period. That's why businesses like Boeing and Airbus and Microsoft and Oracle and a lot of the energy businesses are just saying, nope, we're out, at potentially significant cost to them, especially the energy businesses. So that's the sort of thing that we will need to be thinking about. And if there are any audit executives who are watching our webinar today, I would definitely recommend that you all sit down with your compliance team and think about, maybe we should re-audit our export control regime and systems, procedures, policies. Do that right now. Your governance of distributors, audit all of your efforts to govern them and make sure they work. Think about how you're going to get reports or assurances from your distributors, and what are you going to tell the senior command in the boardroom or in the C-suite about this, because they are going to worry about it. That's probably going to be the most immediate impact for a lot of businesses. That's what I've got at the moment, Tom. And I got a couple of other risks that we could talk about too, but export controls is going to be the big thing.
Mr. Armstrong, do you have a comment or question for Matt?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great points that Matt made. Just talking from the coal face, one thing I would watch out for is what you might call a reflagging of Russian assets. I think we're already seeing, Russian corporations try and rebrand, if you like. So traditionally, I know many of them have operated through Cypriot entities or Swiss entities, Luxembourgese entities. I'm seeing the Gulf quite a lot. So it seems to be relatively easy to set up an operation in Dubai and seemingly to attempt to bypass sanctions that way. So it's not a simple task for compliance officers to go, Russia, no, tick. They're going to have to look, I think, at the history behind some of their suppliers and third parties as well, and see if they were, let's just say, a business that has recently changed location, because that might get them into sanctions issues as well if the ultimate beneficial owner is still a Russian entity.
It's a good point that a lot of this will sound like, okay, that's due diligence, which it is. And you might be thinking, well, we've got some good experience with due diligence before. We'll have to apply it again. But it's absolutely true that they're going to reflag their assets. That's a wonderful phrase. I think it captures it. But the issue here is that with the FCPA, you're just trying to figure out, who is this customer I'm selling to? Now, with export controls, you're also thinking about, and how will they use my product? That's different than FCPA compliance. And that is an extra level of complexity. And especially for some firms, not terribly up on your FCPA compliance. Maybe for some reason you had low corruption risk in Russia. I don't know how that's possible, but maybe it is. But now the export control risks will be, I think, affecting a much wider pool of companies. And you're going to have to think of two different variables at the same time. Who is this person? What are they going to do with my product? And that's going to be the issue.
So I don't know whose phone went off, but please turn it off. There's another piece of information that we don't talk about very often. And in the export control world, it's something you should be doing, and that's a end user certificate. An end user certificate is what a distributor or a reseller is supposed to have signed, saying who is the end user of these goods. That can actually be a very useful tool now for several reasons. Number one, whoever signs that end user certificate, whether it be your export control person or the eventual customer, needs to be aware that you're signing that under the pains and penalties of perjury. Number two, that having that end user certificate is a critical piece of information that you can use to trace and track to whom the equipment has gone. It is both name and company. So if you see similar names, you can use that. I recognize that this is a really into the weeds piece of information and data, but this is a situation where you're really going to need to go into the weeds to try to comply with the sanctions levied by the Biden administration and the EU and protect your company as well. So there's some information out there that the anti-corruption compliance professional may not be aware of that they can use in this situation. And so, Karen Woody. Matt, could you say that again? We can barely hear you.
Just wanted to say I agree with all of the end use certificate stuff, but think of, how am I going to store this? What is my documentation capability for all that? Because that's going to go way up too.
Karen, what have you been thinking about in connection with this crisis?
Thanks, Tom. It's good to be here again. But my topic, and the one I've been thinking about related to Russia and Ukraine, is corruption and the role that corruption is playing in this conflict. And more importantly, I think the role that corruption has played leading up to this conflict. And just by way of personal story, when I started practicing law, the first case I was put on was a huge multinational Foreign Corrupt Practices Act case. We represented a global company that was headquartered in Germany, and we were conducting an internal investigation that spanned the globe. And while I spent most of my time on that case in Asia and sort of in the Far East, a number of my colleagues were on every other continent. But the thing that stuck with me is that the one country where we couldn't complete the work, we ended up just, throwing our hands up, was Russia. I mean, attorneys there had their hotel rooms bugged. They were followed at night. We ended up just turning back to the DOJ and saying, we can't finish this. This is actually, at our own sort of risk. And what was surprising to me then as a young attorney is that wasn't super surprising to anyone. And so what really was a takeaway for me, even though this was, over 15 years ago, was that it was nearly a foregone conclusion that corruption was just the way of doing business in Russia. And that's something that has definitely stuck with me. And I had since cases in Russia since that time, also usually about FCPA and sanctions issues. But it was something where that was just kind of understood of how things went. And, not to cast, aspersions against Russian and the anti-corruption efforts they've made maybe since that time. But that was very much sort of this understood, it felt understood that was just, like I said, foregone conclusion. So what does that have to do actually with Ukraine and this current conflict? Well, I posit, as I think many others do, and that's that Russia's sort of deep-rooted corruption is one of the reasons Putin's been free to engage in these insidious and sort of inhumane acts that he's been doing now vis-a-vis Ukraine. And how he does that, he's relying on security services. He's relying on the corruption of the oligarchy that he has set up around him. And those people are able to line his wallet, give him the means to sort of keep this culture of corruption going. And for a long time, it seems that the West has made few, if any, sort of inroads into trying to sort of cut the head off of that snake. I think this Ukraine flare up, if that would be a euphemism, I think at this point, but this actual war has made everyone wake up and realize how well resourced Putin is and how much that will affect this entire conflict. And then all of, these other countries that are going to be embroiled in it by virtue of the fact that, these oligarchs have properties, yachts, all these things in other countries, and they're being protected that way. And so this will get into the sanctions I know Jonathan's going to talk about, but we've seen, I think, some incredible movement in just the past few weeks from the United States, European Union, Canada, UK, all these nations announcing those sanctions, cutting off the Russian banks from the SWIFT system, and preventing things like the Russian bank from drawing on foreign currency reserve. These are efforts that I think are trying to staunch the flow of resources, certainly. And then we've also seen recently the Biden administration has announced the Transatlantic Task Force and I think it's called klepto capture, this idea of having an interagency law enforcement group to weed out the oligarchs and sort of attempt to freeze assets of certain individuals and companies that are playing a role here. But here, I think there's work to be done, and I think there are things in the pipeline that will assist, but I would hope that they would be fast tracked. And in this place, I'm going to crib a little bit from the always interesting Matthew Stevenson and his Global Anti-Corruption blog, which I think he's done a great job following this from the corruption standpoint. And he recently had a blog where he pointed out 3 really important measures that the United States can be doing to further crack down on this flow of finances. And so one is, I think, an obvious one, and that is, again, leaning on the FinCEN's recent Corporate Transparency Act, which was enacted a year ago in January 2021 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. But they had it out for notice and comment. I think the period just closed on February 7th. But as Matthew pointed out, I think it's a valid point. That law, which requires most private companies to report who the true beneficial owners are to FinCEN, and again, it's an attempt to try to curb money laundering, corruption, terrorist financing. All that is what's baked into this law. like I said, the proposed rule just closed for comment, but what will be important to think about is how much, even after the final rule is effectuated, how soon this goes into effect, which could be up to maybe a year. So in terms of when people need to be complying with it, when companies need to comply. So I think the speed at which we can get people up to acknowledging, looking at who, again, the beneficial owners are of many of the in these industries is an important one. So the role of, again, FinCEN, the tighter AML rules around this, certainly as it relates to the real estate sector. There's been a lot written on the luxury properties in New York and London that many of these oligarchs have, and thinking through, again, how we suss out who is owning this. I know FinCEN just in October had announced the renewal of its geographic targeting orders, which requires U.S. title insurance companies to identify the actual natural persons behind shell companies that are buying all cash purchases of real estate, usually residential real estate. So these, I think, are efforts that are pushing us toward trying to, like I say, cut the head off the snake of how to make sure that these people aren't still able to fund Putin and some of these things that are happening over in Russia. And so I think the efforts toward, again, beneficial ownership regulations, understanding, where this money is coming from, where it's going through. There is this idea of maybe even having real estate brokers needing to file suspicious activity reports like SARS as part of AML programs. All of these ideas, I think, are worth hearing out and ensuring that we have really robust compliance programs in the AML space so that people and companies aren't unwittingly playing a hand in this, global conflict by way of lining the pockets of those that are just doing harm. And so that is what I've been thinking about and trying to wrestle with. Again, when people think about what can I do, what's our role here, I think there's a lot of ways that we might not know that we are sort of implicitly involved. And so getting to the root of things like this, where is this money going? Who's selling? What are these shell companies? Who's actually owning this is, I think, an important step toward rooting out a source of power that Putin enjoys.
So, Karen, do you see a role for the SEC in this, or do you see more of the enforcement side coming from the Department of Justice and Treasury through the use of the AML law of 2020?
That's a really good point. I mean, OFAC and FinCEN Treasury really does seem to be the first mover on this, but there's no reason the SEC wouldn't also be involved. Obviously, through FCPA type of anti-corruption things, the SEC will be in the room for those things as well. But in terms of any companies listed on the exchanges or other places where the SEC has jurisdiction over ADRs or sort of foreign listed companies, and ensuring, this idea of figuring out who owns them, double checking the disclosures of these companies. Matt's pointing out that the SEC does exams looking at who these broker dealers are and requiring, again, more pressure on brokers of doing kind of a know your customer type analysis of figuring out, again, who they're assisting. I think there is definitely room and opportunity for the SEC to dial that up. I think they have that mandate authorized by Congress, and especially when we're thinking about this as related to impacting markets and the volatility of markets, and the idea of this being all obviously very systemic risk. I think it's appropriate for the SEC to step into that space.
Jonathan Marks, what do you have for us in the area of sanctions?
Well, we keep talking a little bit about this. So, as our conversations sort of manifested themselves, it got me to thinking a little bit more. And Karen and Matt and Jonathan, I certainly appreciate all your comments. There's a couple things that I wanted to mention first. I mean, everything that everybody said, really, everyone should pause right now and take out your risk assessment, your enterprise-wide risk assessment, and blow on it and see if it still holds water. I mean, because this to me, I mean, we had a pandemic that we all went through. There were certain things. You talk about the SEC. There were certain cases that came out as a result of that because people were hiding behind that crisis a little bit. This may be a crisis for some and not for others. So, from a disclosure perspective, I'm sure the SEC is going to be on full alert when it comes to this because they have some recent pains relating to this. But overall, I mean, if internal audit is not talking to compliance and the general counsel's office right now, including the senior leadership and the board of directors with regards to the risks and the enterprise-wide risks, I mean, internal risks are one thing, but go enterprise-wide. Matt had some great comments about export controls. Karen, was talking about FCPA risk, anti-bribery, anti-corruption risks. Jonathan was talking about cyber risks and things like that. These are all real risks that most of us face on a regular and ongoing basis. And they may have been medium or low before, but they could have changed as a result of all this. And I think it's really incumbent upon us, if we really buy into the regulatory guidance that's been issued over the past couple of years, talking about feedback and making sure that it's not a set it and forget it exercise, to really take those things off, dust them, and revisit every single one of those things that are on there. I mean, that's good governance all around. It's not just good governance around, export controls and other things. It's good governance in general from a risk management perspective to do this. And since the onus has really been placed on the board, as a result of a lot of the cases that have come to pass, over the past year and a half related to Caremark, and we've all realized what's happening there. If you're a board of director today, it's the first question I'm asking. Is our risk assessment really where it should be? And what are the things that we should be doing proactively to make sure that we're covering ourselves as an organization? And so, that got me to think. With regards to sanctions, getting back to all these sanctions, I think you really need to understand, what the sanctions are all about. And again, use that to see how it will potentially impact your organization. Whether it's supply chain, whether it's cyber, whether it's bribery and corruption. The other thing is, that I keep thinking about is, if you're doing services into Russia, how are you going to get paid? How are you going to get paid for those services? We all know about the SWIFT banking system and the severe, connection between the U.S. severing the U.S. financial systems for Russia's largest financial institutions, Sberbank, and full blocking sanctions on Russia's second largest financial institution, VTB Bank. I mean, I could go on and on about all the sanctions that are out there. I think that's less important. You can all go read about them online. They're all listed there, and they're highlighted, appropriately. When it comes to really the impact on the organization, now is the time to do this. You can't wait. And if you're doing it now and you haven't done it already, maybe shame on all of us. But I would really encourage everyone to go find your risk assessment or your risk assessments, including AML and BSA. To your point about KYC, there are some programs out there we know that KIC, like from a broker and dealer perspective, as Matt, poignantly said, that the SEC examination division is looking at broker dealers just because of the compliance around maybe KYC. And we all know that some of the cases that have come forth that KYC has been weak. But we also all know that AML BSA programs in some of the largest financial institutions over the years have been, picked on and for good reason, because they're not effective. And so, again, this all boils down to risk at the end of the day and managing that risk effectively. And if this is not a wake-up call for every chief compliance officer, chief audit director, chief financial officer, and the board, I don't know what is. But getting back to sanctions and talking about the guidance that I mentioned before, going back to that January 12th, 2017, guidance on the provision for certain services related to the requirements of the compliance services. It's called the compliance services guidance. You should definitely dust that off. It may not be 100% appropriate in your situation, but I would encourage you to read it. And if you do have questions, I would encourage you to reach out to your general counsel or to lawyers that really do understand this, like Tom and Karen, because I'm sure that they could provide you with the requisite guidance. But don't go at this alone. It's just too important. And the last thing you want to do is be on the other end of an OFAC violation.
Matt, you have a comment or question for Jonathan?
Well, just two thoughts I wanted to put into the listeners' heads here. One is a story that I encountered earlier today, where a Russian oil tanker was looking to dock and distribute its oil supplies into the world market I think in the Baltic Sea. And that is still legal right now. Let's remember that oil exports from Russia are still legal, except the dock workers at the docks said, we're not going to do that. We don't care what sanctions are or are not. They just saw the political and moral sensibilities of this variable here, this situation, and they said, we're out. We're not going to do it. So for lack of any dock workers, the Russian tanker then, I guess, had to sail off to parts unknown, and I don't know where they're going to unload their oil. But that's a point that a lot of companies are also going to need to think about, especially if you have the more operations you have in Eastern Europe, the more you're going to have to think through, are our with anything that we might propose to do in Russia? Because Europeans I know want nothing to do with Russia anymore. Until when? Until like Putin is gone. And if that's 20 years, they are perfectly willing never to talk or deal with Russia again for another 20 years. So think through what some of your political and moral issues are going to be with your workforce about something so inflammatory or divisive. I don't know what the adjective is. But the second point I wanted to get at is, it so happens that for the last several months, I've been reading a few histories of World War II. And one thought that has come to mind as I've been listening to things here is the mass mobilization that the West had against Germany during World War II, where everybody in the United States was involved in the war effort against them. We're eventually going to get to some sort of position like that against Russia, that there's going to be a mass mobilization of compliance and risk management efforts. All of it is going to be thinking through Russia risk, Russia risk, Russia risk. And Karen, even when she said that, maybe we're going to have real estate brokers file suspicious activity reports, probably a lot of them are saying, I'm going to do what? Well, guys, if we have to do a mass mobilization of compliance efforts to contain Russia, that's what this is going to look like. If this lasts for years, and it may well, companies will need to be thinking in more and more about how this is going to be an all-pervasive, back-of-the-mind concern for the C-suite and the board. What is our Russia risks, and how are we going to deal with them?
Mr. Armstrong, you have a comment or question as well?
Yeah, I have live ship tracking for you. So the two vessels that Matt were referring to.
That's great.
So they're the Boris Vilakitsky and the Fedor Litka. And they were actually turned away from the UK. And it seems to be a concerted effort by Unison, the trade union. And Unison have said that they were behind it and that they are, quote, determined to support the Ukrainian people and uphold the sanctions imposed against Russia. So there was technically not a sanctions violation because the sanctions attached to the vessel, not the cargo, and the ship seemed to sail under a Cypriot flag. But I can tell you, as we speak, they look like they're headed to, I'd be guessing, Kaliningrad. They've gone up the North Sea, past Holland, and it looks like they're trying to get back to a Russian port from what I can see. But that's a first for the podcast, isn't it? Live ship tracking.
Yeah, and Matt, you could download that app on iTunes or the Android store at Find My Super Tanker. It's an app. So,
I mean, as funny as this is, and although I do applaud the dock workers for doing this, even if dock workers were going to go along with this idea, what if the insurance carrier suddenly decides we're not going to insure that tanker? In which case, that tanker is not going to be allowed to dock, or a plane won't be allowed to land. There's going to be any number of third parties who might suddenly say, we're out, we're done with Russia. And whatever transaction you might be having, that's going to grind to a halt. So that is yet another example of how this is going to wind up infiltrating all of your calculations about transactions with that country.
Yeah, Matt, you make a good point. I had a conversation last night with a pilot who flies cargo runs back and forth, and he said the same thing. His fear is that he gets there and he won't be able to land, and there'll be nobody there to take the cargo off the plane.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now to our fan favorites, which of course is shout outs and rants. So we'll keep the same order. I'm relatively sure that my shout out will not be taken by anyone else because I'm going to shout out to the Texas GOP. So with that, Mr. Armstrong, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
Yeah, only slightly trying to raise the mood slightly. My shout out is to Paddington Bear. So Paddington Bear was created in 1958. But why was Paddington Bear created, you might ask? Well, it was created by Michael Bond, who'd seen the horrors of war. He actually tried to sign up, but was rejected because he was too young when he was 17 in World War II. And nobody knows for certain, but he was either motivated by the Kindertransport or the refugees exiting London to get away from bombing in the Blitz. So Paddington Bear was effectively a refugee, as many of us know, from darkest Peru, but it was meant to give hope to refugees everywhere. Paddington had a note round his neck that said, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." As I said, it was to give hope, particularly to refugee children, that even if they're clumsy, even if they're at times annoying, even if they're not in the environment that they think they're going to be in, there are people out there who love them. That might be random strangers who take them in. It might be Mr. Gruber, himself a Hungarian emigre who's been through it all 60 years earlier. A point of trivia, the first Paddington Bear doll was given to Jeremy Clarkson. So it inspires hopes in some, but not in all. But why is it relevant to today? Well, first of all, there are many thousands, hundreds of thousands of children going through the same horrors that we had in the Second World War. So Paddington's there for them. And why do they know about Paddington if they're from Ukraine? Well, of course, because the Paddington movies were shown in the Ukraine. And who voiced those movies? Who was the voice of Paddington? Well, President Zelensky. And it's horrific, isn't it, that a nation expects a comedian to step up to the plate and offer leadership in a time like this. He shouldn't have had to, but he did. So my shout out is to Paddington and his Ukrainian manifestation, President Zelensky.
Well, I think we may have set the bar with that one, but we still have 4 more to go. So, Matt, what do you have for us?
Well, I won't meet that bar. That is an excellent one. So first, I want to sneak in a quick advertisement. Tom Trust won't be objectionable, but on Wednesday, March 23rd, compliance officers in Boston. If you are watching this, we will be having another Boston compliance meetup. The reason I am promoting it is that Radical Compliance has also turned this into a Ukraine charity relief fundraiser. So anybody who shows up and you donate right there at the bar online, as far as I'm concerned, to either the International Rescue Committee or to Jose Andres food relief programs, Radical Compliance will match your donations up to $50. It is on Wednesday, the 23rd. Find me online. I'll give you all the registration details. But rants and raves.
Matt, I'm gonna stop you. I'm going to stop you right there because the Compliance Podcast Network will also match any donations.
Well, thank you very much. I will send you the receipts when we have all the documentation after that. The shout out I want to give today is to a young Texas man named Jackson Reffitt, age 19. For those of you who do not know what he has done, Jason Reffitt had to testify in Washington, D.C. this week against his father, Guy Reffitt, age 50, who is the first January 6th insurrectionist to actually go to trial. He is being tried on insurrection charges in Washington, D.C. right now. Mr. Reffitt is a recruiter for the 3% group, which is one of those anti-government militia crackpot outfits out there. He was very active in the January 6th coup attempt. And his son, Jason Reffitt, at the age of 18 at the time, he dined out his dad to the FBI, and now he's testifying against him. And I cannot imagine how personally difficult that must be when you are that young to do that against your father. So a shout out to Jason Reffitt, who is apparently the only one in that family who has a good sense of what the United States and loving your country is about, because he's the one defending it against this crackpot 3%er dad of his, who is one of the people making a mess of the country and trying to burn it down. We need more people like Jason Reffitt ready to step and talk about what is right in America and then do the right thing. And he did. So hats off to him.
Karen Woody.
So my shout out today is a somber one that goes along with the theme for today. And I want to shout out to the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, who could not be more, in my mind, of someone who speaks truth to power and a model of just upstanding honor in the face of what is it seems to be unspeakable tragedy. And his speech on Monday at the UN General Assembly, wherein he read the text messages of one of the Russian soldiers to his mother, and that soldier ended up being killed, I thought was such an incredible and powerful moment to humanize this thing that we have been inundated with from, talking heads and pundits and sort of nonstop news. But I just thought, what a powerful way to bring this home in a way that acknowledges that these are people and these are kids. A lot of these being Russian conscripts. Yeah, not to be a cynic here, but what powerful message it sends even to the inefficacy of Putin and his strongman sort of image, that even his soldiers here seem to be not understanding what they're doing, not in favor of what they're doing. And so, like I said, the person who I think is to me, such an incredible representative of this is, and I know I won't say his name probably right, but Sergei Kieslitsia, unless I'm saying that wrong, maybe you guys know. I applaud, again, his ability to have the wherewithal to humanize what's going on in a way that speaks to all of us without it seeming overwrought the way I think many news reporters and journalists can overdo it. I think he is someone who, like I said, made us all stop in our tracks for a minute on Monday, and I appreciate, again, sort of reminding all of us what really is at stake here.
Jonathan Marks, what do you have for us?
I have a rant and a shout out. So I'm going to ride the horse a little bit. Franklin Court Circuit Judge Thomas Wingate ordered Wednesday about in a matter related to my favorite person, Bob Baffert, and that whole big scandal there. So I don't understand any of this, but Judge Thomas Wingate, if you're listening to the compliance podcast here, the guy's guilty. Throw the book at him and just be done with it. Get it off your docket. There's not even a question here. So if you have any questions, you can certainly call me. I'll leave you my number. And then my shout out goes to, it doesn't rarely happen, AJ Leone from Lyndhurst High School in New Jersey is a autistic kid that went to school there and was the basketball team manager. And they put him in at the end of the game. And this guy basket was a buzzer beater. And it was just one of those things. If you haven't watched the video yet, it's just unbelievable. And the coach there and the entire high school should be congratulated, for really just embracing this young man and making him part of the school and just making some memorable moments for everyone. Really a heartwarming story.
So I'm going to start out my shout out with an announcement, which is, for the first time in my adult life, I voted in the Texas GOP primary. So I can no longer say I've never voted in a GOP primary. But my shout out is to the Texas GOP party, because the party denied our corrupt Attorney General Ken Paxton renomination, and he has to now go into a primary against George P. Bush. I didn't vote for George P. Bush. I voted for a former Texas Supreme Court justice who I know, Eva Guzman, but she didn't make the runoff. But nevertheless, even the Texas GOP party realized the corrupt nature of Ken Paxton. He's still under criminal indictment. He has violated numerous Texas laws for which courts have upheld against him, and he has refused to follow their orders. So I'm hoping that, and now I get to vote in the GOP runoff because I voted in the GOP primary. So I'll have 2 votes in the GOP primary for my adult life. So shout out to the Texas GOP party. They at least got that one right. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for this. It's been a somewhat sombering episode, but one that I think everyone needed to talk about, and hopefully it will provide some insights to our listeners on some of the things they can and should do. So I look forward to the next time we're together.